If I hadn't stepped into that house on that ordinary evening, everything I know about myself and about love would look completely different now. My name is Tyler. I'm 23, a son who thought he understood the quiet rhythm of life, working long hours at a modest design firm downtown, sharing dinners with my mother in our small San Diego home, drifting through weeks that all felt the same. I was certain I wasn't built for drama, certain that desire belonged to other people's stories, not mine. But life has a cruel way of proving you wrong at the very moment you least expect it. When my mother turned 50, she planned a celebration in our backyard. It was supposed to be just another family gathering, a night of laughter and friendly toasts under the string lights. I showed up only because I didn't want her to feel alone in her moment of joy. I thought I would smile politely, sip a beer, then vanish quietly into the background. Instead, I saw her Karen, my mother's closest companion, a woman I had only ever known in passing, a familiar shadow at old gatherings, someone who had always belonged to the world of adults while I lingered on the sidelines. That night, she wasn't just another guest. The way the lights brushed her face, the way her calmness seemed to silence the noise around her, it pulled me in before I had the chance to resist. And with a single, reckless sentence spoken half in nerves and half in truth, I unknowingly set fire to a path that would burn for months to come. I grew up in San Diego, in a modest house tucked between quiet streets where the ocean breeze always seemed to sneak in through the windows. My mother and I had lived there since I was a teenager, after my parents' divorce left the two of us to stitch together a life from the scraps. She taught at a local school, known for her patience and her fierce loyalty to friends. I, on the other hand, had built my world behind a computer screen. As a junior graphic designer at a small marketing firm downtown, most of my days revolved around deadlines, muted colors on Photoshop, and the occasional coffee-fueled brainstorming session. It was steady work, not glamorous, but it paid the bills and gave me an excuse to avoid the chaos of social gatherings I never really fit into. By 23, I had grown accustomed to a certain emptiness I didn't have the words for. My life wasn't unhappy, but it was flat, predictable, a page with no bold type. Most evenings ended with me collapsing on the couch, scrolling aimlessly through my phone, or sketching logos that would be forgotten the next day. My friends were few, most having drifted away after college. I told myself it didn't matter. Yet sometimes, late at night, when the city outside was hushed, I would feel the weight of something missing, though I couldn't quite name it. My mother, however, was the opposite. For her 50th birthday, she decided to throw a party that felt larger than life compared to our usual quiet routines. She spent weeks planning the details menus, playlists, the perfect strings of lights to drape across the backyard. I offered to help, but she waved me off with a smile, insisting that she wanted to do this herself. "I've never celebrated me," she said, laughing. "This time I will." There was something almost childlike in her excitement, and I couldn't deny her that joy. When the evening arrived, the backyard was transformed. Warm yellow bulbs glowed from the trees, balloons bobbed lazily in the breeze, and the air buzzed with laughter. Old friends from her college days mingled with current colleagues. Neighbors I only vaguely recognized stopped me to comment on how much I'd grown, as if I were still that boy with dirt on his knees. I nodded politely, clutching a beer to anchor myself in the noise. Despite the cheerful atmosphere, I felt like a stranger in my own home. That was when my eyes caught her. Karen. For years, she had been a quiet presence at family barbecues or holiday gatherings, always arriving with a bottle of wine and a soft smile. Always polite, but never someone I thought about twice. She was part of my mother's circle, one of those friendships so steady it seemed eternal. I remembered vaguely that she was divorced, that she often left early, that she carried herself with an ease I didn't understand. But that night was different. She wasn't dressed to dazzle, only in a simple dark blue dress that moved gently with her. Her hair fell loose around her shoulders, and there was a calmness in her eyes that felt like a still lake in the middle of a stormy crowd. She didn't demand attention, yet I found myself unable to look away. At first I scolded myself. She was older, at least a decade ahead of me, my mother's confidant. She was the kind of person you respected from afar, not someone you allowed into the secret corners of your mind. But the harder I tried to glance elsewhere, the more my gaze kept returning. It wasn't lust in the raw sense, it was something subtler, something I couldn't name. A quiet magnetism, a song without lyrics that still found its way into my chest. I told myself it was just the alcohol, the social awkwardness, the way loneliness sometimes clings harder when surrounded by people. Yet even as I drained another drink, I felt that thread pull tighter. Something was shifting inside me, though I didn't yet realize it was the beginning of a story I wouldn't be able to walk away from. The night deepened, and the party began to hum like a well-tuned instrument, laughter rippling across the lawn, glasses clinking in rhythmic intervals, voices blending into a kind of soundtrack that felt both comforting and overwhelming. I hovered near the drinks table, half wishing to disappear into the shadows. My mother's friends were recounting old stories. Neighbors exchanged gossip, and the faint strains of jazz spilled from the Bluetooth speaker perched by the porch. It should have been background noise, but all of it seemed distant, muffled, as though my senses had tuned themselves toward one frequency only. Karen stood across the yard, leaning slightly as she laughed with my aunt. It wasn't loud laughter, not the kind that commands attention, but the gentle, unhurried kind that seemed to belong to her alone. Her hands moved lightly as she spoke, fingers brushing a strand of hair away, her head tilting to listen. Nothing dramatic, nothing meant to entice, and yet my chest tightened at every small gesture. I tried to ground myself by sipping too quickly from my bottle, the carbonation stinging my throat, but it did little to steady me. The more I stole glances, the more unsettled I became. What was I doing watching her this way? She wasn't just older, she was a woman woven into the fabric of my mother's life. I had no right to imagine her beyond that. And yet, imagination doesn't wait for permission. It sneaks in, uninvited, growing louder the more you deny it. I told myself to move, to find some excuse, collect dirty plates, refill ice, anything to stop staring. But before I realized it, my legs carried me forward. The decision wasn't conscious. One moment I was at the table, the next I was standing beneath the string lights where she happened to be alone, the air thick with the scent of grass and wine. "Hi, Karen," I heard myself say. My voice caught, lower than usual, betraying nerves I wished I could hide. She turned and her face softened in recognition. "Tyler," she said, as if my name itself carried a memory. "I can't believe how grown you are." Her smile wasn't forced, nor distant. It was warm, the kind that makes you feel seen even when you least deserve it. I nodded, fumbling for politeness. "Thanks for coming." "My mom's really happy you're here." "Of course," she replied gently. "She's one of my dearest friends." I wouldn't miss this. It should have ended there, a brief exchange of courtesy before we both melted back into the crowd. But something restless rose inside me, a reckless push I couldn't contain. Maybe it was the alcohol numbing my caution, maybe the years of quiet loneliness pressing for release, or maybe it was simply that I had no choice in that moment but to speak the truth. Before I could stop myself, the words tumbled out, fragile but irreversible. "I would give anything just to be with you." Silence fell like a curtain. The party still roared around us, but between her and me, the world seemed to pause. Karen's expression shifted, neither laughter nor anger, neither dismissal nor encouragement. Her eyes locked on mine, steady, unreadable, as though weighing a confession she hadn't expected. Heat flooded my face. My heart pounded so hard, I thought the sound would betray me. I lowered my gaze, offering a slight nod that was half apology, half retreat. Without waiting for her to answer, I turned away, each step heavier than the last, shame coiling around me. The rest of the evening blurred. I moved mechanically, clearing dishes, nodding through conversations I barely heard. By the time I collapsed on the couch, the light still glowing faintly outside, the words echoed back in my mind like a shot I hadn't known I was capable of firing. 10 words, irreversible, reckless. I muttered to myself, "I must be out of my mind," before sleep finally claimed me. Morning came with the dull throb of a hangover and the mess of a house still wearing the scars of celebration balloons sagging, glasses half filled, confetti sticking stubbornly to the floor. I downed water from the tap and sank into the couch, phone in hand, scrolling out of habit more than interest. And then the screen lit up with a name. Hers. Karen's message was short, but it shook me awake more effectively than any coffee could. "If what you said last night was real, we should talk." I froze. My pulse raced as if I had been caught doing something forbidden. I read the words again, again, and again. My mind scrambled. Did she mean it seriously? Was she offended? Curious? Hopeful? All I knew was that my confession hadn't vanished into the void as I expected. I typed a dozen replies and erased them all. At last, my fingers settled on something raw, something simple. I miss you. If you're willing, I'd like to see you. The message whooshed into the ether, irreversible. My palms sweated as I stared at the screen, waiting. Minutes stretched painfully long until finally, her answer appeared. This afternoon. There's a quiet cafe downtown. I'll send you the address. It felt like my chest expanded and constricted at once. Panic and anticipation collided inside me. I didn't know what I was walking into: ridicule, rejection, or something far more dangerous. But I knew one thing. The story that began with one impulsive sentence had just taken its first deliberate step forward. By noon, my nerves were already frayed. I had changed shirts twice, then a third time, only to end up back in the first one. I brushed my teeth again, though I'd already done it earlier, then sat at my desk rehearsing words that vanished the moment I whispered them. It felt less like preparing for coffee and more like gearing up for a trial where the verdict would reshape my life. I arrived 10 minutes early at the cafe she had chosen, a small place tucked between two bookstores downtown. Its front windows were fogged slightly from the warmth inside, and the faint smell of roasted beans clung to the air even before I pushed the door open. I picked a corner seat with a clear view of the entrance and tried to steady myself with a glass of water. The clinking of dishes, the rustle of pages from a nearby reader, and the faint instrumental music played like background static to my racing heart. When Karen finally walked in, time seemed to slow. She wasn't dressed to impress, but that only made her more striking. A simple green sweater, faded jeans, hair tied back, no makeup. Yet somehow it felt like she carried the quiet gravity of someone who didn't need adornment. She spotted me almost instantly and smiled in that understated way of hers. A smile that wasn't dazzling, but managed to make breathing suddenly seem complicated. "Hello?" she said softly, her voice warm enough to melt the tension around me. "Hamai," I answered, standing too quickly and nearly spilling the water. My awkwardness pulled a light laugh from her, and the sound soothed me more than any practice line could have. We ordered 2 coffees, though I hardly tasted mine. The silence between us in those first moments wasn't hostile, nor was it easy. It was the silence of 2 people standing on opposite edges of a cliff, deciding whether to leap. She was the one to break it. "Do you remember what you said last night?" I nodded, though my throat tightened. I remember the feeling. The words, maybe the wine pushed them out, but it wasn't a lie. Her eyes lingered on me, unblinking. She stirred her coffee slowly, the spoon clinking against the ceramic like a metronome. Finally, she said, "I didn't hate hearing it. I just don't know what to do with it." Relief and terror collided inside me. She hadn't dismissed me, but she also hadn't embraced the idea. I exhaled slowly, trying to keep my voice steady. "I don't expect anything. I just thought, if you felt even a little of what I feel, we should at least be honest about it." Karen tilted her head, studying me as though searching for insincerity. Then she spoke, her tone frank but not unkind. "I've been divorced for 4 years. I stopped imagining love would come knocking again. When someone tells me something sincere, I almost always doubt it." "I'm not here to play games," I replied, surprising myself with how steady my voice sounded. "I know I'm younger, less experienced. But the way I feel about you, it isn't passing curiosity." Her expression softened, just slightly, as if something inside her loosened. "You surprised me," she murmured, "and I can't decide if that's good or dangerous." For the first time since the party, I felt something other than shame. I felt seen. Not entirely accepted, not entirely safe, but no longer invisible. When the cups were nearly empty and our conversation had stretched in quiet, layered threads, Karen stood and gathered her purse. "I can't promise anything," she said, her tone cautious but not closed. "But if you still want to talk, I'll listen." I nodded, unable to hold back the small, unguarded smile that broke across my face. We stepped out into the late afternoon light. It filtered gently through the trees, gilding her hair as she turned to me one last time. Her eyes carried something unreadable but not cold. "Let's keep this between us," she whispered. And then she walked away, leaving me on the sidewalk with a heart that felt both heavier and strangely alive. The following weekend, she chose the meeting place. Not a cafe this time, not any spot where polite chatter might hide what needed to be said. Instead, she suggested the park near Balboa, the one with the lake that caught the evening sky like a polished mirror. I arrived early, my nerves restless enough to keep me pacing the gravel paths. The late afternoon was soft, the kind of California breeze that carried both warmth and a faint chill. I circled the water once, trying to breathe through the pounding in my chest, before I finally saw her waiting. Karen sat on a wooden bench beneath the shade of an old tree, a paper cup in her hand. She wore jeans, a plain white t-shirt, sunglasses resting loosely on her face until she slipped them off and greeted me with a small smile. "You're on time," she said, her voice gentle. "I didn't want to keep you waiting." We began to walk, side by side, along the curved path that traced the water's edge. Our steps fell into an unhurried rhythm, neither of us speaking right away. It wasn't an uncomfortable silence, it was cautious, as though both of us were sorting through thoughts we weren't sure we should release. Finally, she broke it. "I used to think I'd have a family by now." I glanced at her, waiting. "I married young," she continued. "We didn't fight, not really. We just drifted apart until one day there was nothing left to hold on to." After the divorce, I told myself I was fine. No children, no ties, just me and my work. But then years pass and you find yourself eating dinner alone. Not sad, exactly. Just empty. Her words weren't delivered with bitterness. They sounded more like facts she had grown accustomed to. I listened, keeping my eyes on the rippling lake. "Does it still feel empty?" I asked softly. "Sometimes," she admitted. "But I don't feel broken. Just cautious. I don't want to hurt anyone, especially your mother. She's been a true friend to me." Her honesty landed heavily. For the first time, the real barrier between us had a name. It wasn't only the age gap or her doubts about love, it was loyalty, the fear of betraying someone she valued. I stopped walking, turning toward her. "I don't want this to be a game either," I said quietly. "I don't want to hurt my mom. I don't want to hurt you, but pretending this doesn't exist, it's already eating at me." Karen looked at me then, directly, for the first time since we'd met that day. Her eyes were steady but conflicted. Then why say it that night? Why break the silence we'd always had? I swallowed hard. "Because I'd noticed you for longer than I ever admitted. I thought if I kept it hidden it would fade, but it didn't. The alcohol just gave me less time to lie, and I don't regret telling you. Not anymore." She gave a small laugh, though it wasn't mocking. "You know I'm 12 years older than you." "I know," I answered without hesitation. "And it doesn't matter." We reached a bend where the path opened to a view of the lake, glowing with the sinking sun. Karen sat on a bench, and I joined her. For a moment, neither of us moved. She looked down at her hands, then back up, her voice low. "What do you think this is?" "I don't know yet," I admitted, "but I don't want to bury it. I want to find out, even if it's slow." The silence that followed felt heavier than any words. Her eyes searched mine, as if weighing whether to believe me. Finally, she let out a breath, a quiet surrender. "You've surprised me," she said, "and that's not a bad thing." We stood again, continuing down the path. No promises were exchanged, no declarations carved into stone. But the air between us had shifted. Something had crossed from unspoken curiosity into fragile truth. By the time we reached the parking lot, Karen's smile had changed. It wasn't guarded, nor rehearsed. It was lighter, almost reluctant, but real. "Thank you," she said softly. "For what?" "For not making this unbearable." I smiled back, relief loosening the tightness in my chest. "Thank you for not disappearing." She touched my arm lightly before unlocking her car, a fleeting gesture that carried more weight than any kiss. I watched her drive away, the late sun painting the sky in muted gold, and for the first time I felt the strange certainty that something had begun. Not imagined, Not wished for. Begun. A week later, her name lit up my phone again. The message was brief, but it carried the kind of invitation that could change everything. I rented a small place by the coast for the weekend. Do you want to get away from the noise? I didn't need time to think. My reply was immediate. Send me the address. The drive out of San Diego was short enough to feel familiar, yet long enough to shed the weight of routine. By the time I pulled into the quiet street where the Airbnb sat, the sun was melting into the horizon, tinting the ocean with streaks of orange and violet. The house was modest, built with pale wood and wide windows that framed the sea. Potted plants lined the corners of the living room, a single candle flickering faintly on the sill. It didn't look like a vacation rental. It looked like someone's secret refuge. Karen greeted me at the door, her hair loose, a light sweater draped casually over shorts. She looked unguarded, as if I were stepping into a world she rarely let anyone see. Come in, she said simply, and I followed her into the warmth. We made tea in the small kitchen, the sound of water boiling mingling with the faint notes of jazz humming from a speaker. We sat together on the sofa, mugs in hand, conversation drifting easily between work frustrations, half-burned dinners, and the book she'd been reading. It was ordinary talk, but under it pulsed something unspoken, an awareness that the room itself seemed to hold its breath. As the evening cooled, she pulled a blanket over both of us. The gesture was casual, but my pulse quickened at the nearness of her. My hand rested close to hers, almost touching. Silence stretched, comfortable and electric all at once. I turned and she turned with me. For a moment we just looked eyes, searching, questioning, daring. Then I reached out, brushing my fingers against her hand. She didn't pull away. Her smile flickered softly, like a green light, and I leaned in. The kiss was quiet, like the ocean breeze slipping through the window. It wasn't rushed, wasn't hungry. It was confirmation of everything we hadn't said, everything we'd tiptoed around. When we pulled back, Karen let her head rest gently against my shoulder, light as air. I didn't plan for this, she murmured. Neither did I admitted. She gave a small laugh tinged with sadness. We need to be careful. For now, it stays between us. I understand, I said, though my heart pressed against the words. She looked at me again, this time with no hesitation. Only raw honesty. Whatever this is, I don't want to lose it too soon. We stayed like that for hours, letting the sound of the waves fill the silences we didn't dare break. At one point, she asked me about my dreams, the ones I never told anyone. I confessed about photography, about the fear of disappointing my mother. She listened with that same calm focus that made me feel stripped bare, yet safe. Later, as midnight settled in, we sat cross-legged on the rug, a board game spread between us we never finished. Laughter came easier than I expected, and when she reached for a piece, her hand lingered against mine, no longer tentative. That night, we didn't need more than closeness. We sat hand in hand, listening to the waves crash against the shore beyond the glass. There were no grand declarations, no demands for tomorrow. Just the fragile beginning of something neither of us dared to name, but both of us knew was real. And as I drifted into sleep with the rhythm of the ocean in my ears, I realized this wasn't just infatuation born of chance. This was the start of a secret we would both choose again and again, no matter how complicated it became. After that weekend, nothing between us was the same. We didn't call it a relationship, didn't label it with words too heavy for something so new. But the shift was undeniable. We had crossed into a quiet world that belonged only to us, a space stitched together by shared glances, careful gestures, and messages that arrived at just the right moments. Karen and I learned the art of speaking in code. At my mother's lunches, she was still the gracious guest, laughing softly at old stories, helping to clear plates, talking to me as though I were nothing more than a familiar face. But when my mother's back was turned, she would pass close enough to whisper, "That shirt suits you?" or let her hand brush mine for the briefest second. Those fragments were enough to keep me awake at night, smiling into the dark like someone carrying a secret flame. We carved out stolen moments where we could. Sometimes she picked me up a few blocks from my office, the car humming with music as we drove aimlessly through quiet neighborhoods. Other times we slipped into small diners no one we knew would visit, drinking coffee as though it were contraband. The world outside thought nothing of it, just two people passing time. But beneath the surface, every look, every touch was charged. Once, during a rainstorm, we parked by the coast. The windows fogged, rain tapping like impatient fingers on the glass. Karen leaned her head against my shoulder, her breath steady, and I thought, if love could stay this quiet forever, I wouldn't need anything else. And then came the night my mother's eyes sharpened. She had invited a handful of close friends for a modest dinner, far smaller than the birthday celebration. Karen was, of course, among them. I spent the evening pretending everything was normal, pouring wine, chatting with my mother's colleagues, laughing at stories I barely heard. But every time Karen's gaze flickered toward me, my chest threatened to give me away. Later, in the kitchen, as I helped rinse glasses, my mother studied me quietly. She set down a plate, folded her arms, and said, almost casually, "You've been different lately." I forced a smile. "Work's been heavy, that's all." Her eyes narrowed just slightly, not unkind but probing. "You've been smiling for no reason. Distracted. And Karen." She let the sentence trail off, as if she didn't want to finish it. My stomach knotted. I bent down to stack dishes, avoiding her gaze. "She's your friend. We've just seen her more often, that's all." She didn't push, but her silence weighed heavier than any accusation. I felt like a stone had lodged itself in my chest, cold and immovable. That night, after the guests had gone, I sent Karen a message. "She's starting to notice." Her reply came almost immediately. "I could feel it too. Maybe we should step back for a while." I stared at the screen, the words sinking into me like ice. Not anger, not rejection, just fear. Fear of hurting someone who had given both of us pieces of her life. Fear of losing a friendship older than my entire adulthood. For days afterward, everything slowed. Our messages dwindled, our calls grew less frequent. Karen stopped coming over, stopped picking me up. It was as if we had agreed to retreat into separate corners, nursing the fragile secret we were too afraid to expose. I missed her every day, but I kept it inside. I began to realize that what we carried required more than affection. It demanded patience, restraint, even the willingness to pause. Love wasn't only fire, it was endurance. 3 weeks later, we met again, not by accident, but by choice. We picked a secluded park, hidden behind quiet houses, its stone benches facing a still pond. I arrived first, the water reflecting my own restless stillness. When Karen appeared, walking lightly along the gravel, she looked tired but still radiant in that practical, unadorned way. She sat beside me, silence stretching before she finally whispered, "I'm sorry for pulling away." I shook my head. "Don't be." I understood, but it felt like losing a piece of myself. Her eyes brimmed with conflict, and for the first time I saw her fear laid bare not of me, but of the life we were risking by being honest. That afternoon, with the fading sun on the pond, we promised nothing dramatic. Only this, to move slowly, step by step, without letting go. And though the promise was fragile, it was enough to make me believe again. After that quiet promise in the park, we no longer hid from each other emotionally. We still lived behind the veil of secrecy, careful under my mother's watchful eyes. But when Karen and I spoke, the hesitations had melted. Our words carried a new weight, not tentative, not experimental, but deliberate. Nights became our sanctuary. When the house was silent, when my mother had gone to bed, Karen and I would talk on the phone in hushed voices. Some nights she washed dishes while I listened to the clink of plates over the line. Other nights, I described the city streets as I walked home, as though she were beside me. The conversations weren't filled with declarations of love. Instead, they were stitched together by small truths. Her memories of her father reading poetry in a gravelly voice. My confession that I once dreamed of leaving design behind for photography. Each secret shared was like a brick laid carefully into the foundation of something we didn't yet dare to name. On weekends, when the risk was lower, she drove me out of the city. We'd spread a blanket on an empty patch of grass, share sandwiches, and laugh at nothing in particular. Karen often slipped off her shoes and stood barefoot on the earth, her eyes closed, arms loose at her sides as if she were catching the wind itself. I would watch her and think, this is peace. No grand gestures, no lavish dates, just presence. Just us. But there were nights when the weight of secrecy pressed harder. At a dinner my mother hosted, Karen's smile lingered on me a beat too long, and my mother's gaze followed the silence that bloomed between us. Later, when the dishes were being cleared, she looked at me with a suspicion that cut sharper than words. You and Karen, you seem closer, she said, her voice casual, but her eyes anything but. I swallowed, forcing a laugh. She's your friend, Mom. We've just spent more time together lately, but the stone in my chest grew heavier. That night I told Karen. Her response was immediate, almost resigned. Maybe we should pause before she finds out. I don't want to betray her trust. We didn't call it a breakup, but the days that followed felt hollow. Messages became fewer, the silence stretched longer. Still, I knew we hadn't let go. We had only stepped back, waiting for courage to catch up with our hearts. 3 weeks later, we met again at a secluded park, as if drawn by an invisible thread. Karen looked worn, her eyes shadowed by doubt. I thought I was strong enough, she admitted softly. But the truth is, I'm terrified. Terrified of hurting your mother. Terrified of ruining everything I've built with her. And terrified of pulling you into something unfair. Her honesty ached. I clasped her hand gently. I wasn't dragged into this. I chose it, and I'll keep choosing it. Slowly if we must, patiently, but not never. She turned away, then back, her eyes shining with unshed tears. Every time my phone is quiet too long, I check it like a teenager. And when your name appears, I feel alive again. I squeezed her hand tighter. That's enough for now. We don't need promises carved in stone, just don't let go. She nodded, and in that moment, something shifted. Our love had grown beyond impulse, beyond secrecy. It was now a choice, deliberate and steady, even in fear. In the weeks that followed, we stopped circling each other like shadows. We began to plan, not loudly, not with fanfare, but in whispers and notes. A 2-bedroom apartment with a small balcony. Therapy sessions Karen returned to, not because she was weak, but because she wanted to be strong enough for us. A journal I kept, pouring into its pages the words I wasn't yet ready to say aloud. Sometimes, when I wrote late at night, I pictured my mother's reaction. One entry ended with, "She'll cry, but then she'll understand." Another, darker, read, "Maybe she'll never forgive me." The uncertainty scared me, but even scarier was the thought of hiding forever. By December, we had marked a date, December 30th. No party, no distraction, just the quiet intersection between 1 year and the next. That day, I would sit with my mother and tell her the truth. Not to wound, not to betray, but to stop hiding. Karen sent me a message the night before. No matter what happens, I will choose you. Even if I have to wait outside the door, I'll be here. I replied with trembling fingers, tomorrow I choose you too. Not in secret, not in silence, but in the open. I didn't know how my mother would react, whether she would cry, rage, or retreat into silence, but I knew hiding had already cost us too much. Love, if it was real, didn't deserve the shadows. And so, on the edge of the new year, I prepared myself to step into the light with her, knowing there was no turning back. That was my story, the way one reckless confession turned into a journey I never imagined I'd take. Love doesn't always appear the way we expect, and it rarely asks permission. Sometimes it comes quietly, asking us to choose it every single day, even when the cost feels heavy. If this story stirred something in you, if you've ever carried a secret you couldn't share, or found yourself standing at the edge of a choice you weren't ready to make, then you know how fragile and powerful love can be. Stay with us. Subscribe, share, leave a comment. Tell me what you would have done if you were in my place, because your voice is part of these stories too.